Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our distinguished guests joining us today from around the world. My name is Delano Roosevelt. I am the President and CEO of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. We are an educational nonprofit located here in Washington, D.C. Today, it's my distinct honor to welcome you to today's timely and critical discussion titled A Post-Assad Syria: Dilemmas, Diplomacy, and a New Strategic Vision. This is the Council's second webinar on Syria since the fall of Bashar al-Assad last December. As regional dynamics shift and global powers reassess their strategies in this time of accelerated change in Syria and its region, the goal of this panel is to examine the role of international diplomacy and explore prospects for new strategic vision that prioritizes stability, reconstruction, and inclusive governance. We are here to assess possibilities for a sustainable post-conflict Syrian state. To navigate these complex decisions, we are honored to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts who will provide critical insights to these pressing issues. We will begin today's discussion with a keynote remark from Senior Bureau official Mr. Timothy Lenderking. Mr. Lenderking serves in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the United States Department of State. He previously served as President Biden's U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen from 2021 to 2025. He's also served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Affairs, where he has become and known as a highly respected career member of the senior foreign servants. I'm proud to say that also Tim has been a longtime supporter of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations, speaking at our annual policymakers conferences, online events, and numerous student programs, including last year's National Model Arab League. He cares deeply about students, and he's always been ready to help guide them along their individual pathways towards a career on the international stage through his great depth and knowledge and personal experience of Middle Eastern and North African issues. Throughout his career, Tim has been deeply involved in every aspect of diplomacy, from negotiations to politics to economics, and most importantly, safeguarding human security. He's played a leading role in mediating the Yemen conflict. His insights today will provide valuable and vital context on how the Trump administration views the Syria conflict. Tim, we are pleased and honored to welcome you to our conversation. Sir, the floor is yours.
Del, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you. Thanks to the National Council for organizing. It's very timely, I think, to talk about Syria. It's a hot topic. I know that people are interested, but thank you, and kudos for assembling such an excellent panel of speakers whom I'm keenly interested to hear from as well. I thought it would be useful just to start out and sort of set a framework of how we in this administration see Syria, the engagements going forward. There's hardly a day that goes by in the Middle East Bureau, and indeed with Secretary Rubio, where Syria doesn't come up in some way or form. I can assure you that the many Arab heads of state and foreign ministers who come through town, everybody's talking about Syria, and everybody has a perspective that they want to share with us. In general, I would say they fall more into a category of really encouraging us to engage robustly and energetically with the new leadership. We're not there yet, to be quite honest. We're looking for an opportunity where we can build confidence with the new leadership They are, as you know, designated as terrorists according to the United States. The organization HTS is a designated terrorist organization. These are not things that can be remedied overnight, but there's a keenness on the part of the United States to engage and really see what these guys are made of and whether they are serious about turning a corner on their past, on their previous ideologies. You know, it's interesting that both the secretary and Arab foreign ministers who come into town, you know, talk about the leadership in a similar way. You know, people use remarks like they would fail the FBI background investigation. They have PhDs in jihad. These are common sentiments. Nobody attempts, I think, to gloss over where El-Shara and Shaibani and some of the other leaders of HTS have come from, what their backgrounds are. But you know, the kinds of things that they're talking about are very striking. And if they begin or can in some cases can continue on some of the pathways that they themselves have committed to, there's a real opportunity for confidence building with the United States that could lead to, you know, much bigger and better things. We of course have levied sanctions on Syria, on the leadership. Those are not going to come off overnight. We're not going to be rushing back into, as some countries have done, and we respect everybody moving sort of at their own tempo here. It's not for us to dictate how other countries approach this problem set, but we do see an eagerness on the part of some of our you know, partners around the world to reopen, establish embassies, run the flag up the flagpole. We're just not there yet. In fact, we're taking a very, you know, approach of cautious engagement. Let me just add another point, which is that for me, Syria has a personal element. I served in Damascus early in my foreign service career as my second tour at the U.S. Embassy in Damascus. My wife and I were very keen to go to Syria, and we had our first child, in fact, born at Shami Hospital in Damascus. And we used the opportunity to travel all over that country at the time. And it was a wonderful country to explore. I mean, the antiquities are really unparalleled. There were few tourists there. There were no hassles of, you know, sort of approaching antiquities. Much of the antiquities, probably this is something that we would later regret, were unguarded. Right. So I know that people, you know, may have walked off with bits and pieces of things, but when you could explore the old city of Aleppo and Croix de Chevalier and the dead cities, and, you know, we could camp out, we could go to remote areas of the desert, you know, beautiful extinct volcanoes, and you could camp there. I mean, it really gave you an appreciation for Syria, put it on the map, on the human map, right? The longevity of human engagement in that territory, the street called Straight in downtown Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque. These are incredible treasures. My younger brother, in fact, came out and lived with us for a year and stayed with us for a while, and then moved into the old city. And we just had incredible experiences, and we didn't realize at the time that you know, this was the tail end of the Hafiz al-Assad, you know, regime. I had a chance to meet him on one occasion, and pretty much everybody in the embassy dismissed Bashar as someone not up to the task of running Syria, and certainly that was the case. I don't think any of us foresaw that he would rule in such a belligerent and malicious and destructive way. I mean, I don't know that we saw that coming, but the heir apparent, Basil, of course, had been killed in a car accident some years before. But and the other thing that, you know, struck me is that while it was very difficult to interact with Syrians because we were the United States and the Syrian regime was implacably hostile to us, 2 points. One, our ambassador, a very esteemed Arabist, Chris Ross, very good Arabic speaker, had been our ambassador for several years. You know, had a personal relationship with Hafiz al-Assad and would go into these long meetings with the leader in, you know, do the entire engagement in Arabic and come out, and we'd all wait for these. Typically were one-on-one meetings. we'd all hang on, we'd be like clustered at the door of the embassy, wanting to know what discussions were going down, had gone down. So it was an incredible moment, but we had good people at the embassy. I'm really pleased that Robert Ford is on this panel as well, someone who knows the country very well and was our last ambassador there. I hope we get back to a day when we can reposition someone. I just want to close with a couple of points about what we are looking for from the Syrian government, because I think there's been a lot of speculation, and I mentioned that some countries have rushed in very quickly. We're in touch with them. We're in touch with G7, Japan, the European partners, and as I mentioned, many of the Arab partners about how we should approach this government. We've laid out to them in very specific terms. We felt that let's not make this a guessing game with the Syrian leadership. We have very specific things that we want them to do that can help establish confidence. And if they're willing to do these things, none of which we believe are impossible, we're not setting this relationship up for failure. We want this to succeed. And these are very much things that, again, that the Syrian leadership has pledged that they would do publicly and privately. And of course, folks like Robert and many others. We had 2 congressmen in Damascus last week, and many others that we talked to from the diaspora. So I consider that we have very current information, and we toggle, very actively between different assessments that we get from people who are there, who've met the man, who've talked to him. And we've had a couple of, touches with the foreign minister in which we've articulated some of our goals. But, I will share a few of them with you because I think it's helpful. Some of this is already in the public realm anyway. Of course, we seek information about Americans who have disappeared in Assad's prisons, wherever they are. I was very pleased that Al-Shara had met with Deborah Tice. Austin Tice, of course, is very much in our hearts. We need to know where he is. But there are others as well. There are a number of Americans who we do not know what their condition is, where they are. So we call on the Syrian government to work with us to find those Americans, establish their fate. We are very keen and determined to see that Iran does not gain foothold back in Syrian territory. We know that Iran continues to try and exploit this period of transition, and Iranian-backed groups like Hezbollah and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine should have no base, no foothold in Syria. This directly threatens U.S. interests, Israel's security. Let's keep Iran out of Syria. We count on the interim authorities to combat terrorism, especially from ISIS. We remain committed to that mission, and I would highlight the critical role that our crucial partners play, the Syrian Democratic Forces. They continue to play in degrading ISIS. We welcome the announcement of an agreement between the interim authorities and the SDF to integrate the Northeast into a unified Syria, very important development. We're watching how do these ceasefires and agreements develop, and how are they implemented in places like Aleppo, Tishreen Dam, Deir ez-Zor, Afrin. We recognize the implementation of these agreements are fraught with challenges, but the parties must come to a solution that ensures that ISIS and any other terror group can never again resurge in Syria. We must see the destruction of all chemical weapons and chemical weapons precursors in Syria. We note the positive engagement that the Syrian authorities have had with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, based in The Hague. This is a very promising beginning, but we need to see the identification and the destruction of these weapons. We must see also that Syria becomes a state that adopts non-aggression principles towards neighboring states and finds and counters those who seek to stabilize the region. Heartened by the arrest this week of 2 leading members of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, more of that needs to take place. We recognize that Syria must have its own military and security structure, but are watching the implementation of this closely. A much more difficult area, but very important to us. The interim authorities need to make sure that foreign terrorist fighters have no role in Syria's government or military. We look back on very tragic events that took place in March on the Syrian coast, terrible evolution of events where Iran and former Assad elements triggered a bloodbath. Many innocent Alawites and other Syrians were killed in the upsurge. But why are Chechen and Uyghur fighters killing Syrian citizens in Syria? What qualifies them to hold official positions there? While we have seen HTS statements and rhetoric committing to investigate these coastal events, we've been clear. We need to see the perpetrators held to account through legitimate legal mechanisms. We note the investigation and the peacekeeping committees the interim authorities have launched and await their results. Accountability is essential for stability and social cohesion. We must see the interim authorities begin to expel all foreign fighters from official posts as a sign of their commitment to Syrian regional stability. There are qualified Syrians who are not terrorists throughout the world and from within Syria who are capable of filling key government and security positions. We want to see them return and serve in the new era of Syria. We also need to see a Syrian military that protects all Syrian peoples and does not threaten its neighbors. Let me just close. I mean, Syria is at a unique moment. Many of us feel strongly about the opportunity that exists. Syria has such an important role to play in the region, in a very volatile region. And rarely do countries face such distinct turning points where they can break with the ruin that came before. So we urge the Syrian authorities to choose policies that will reinforce stability for Syria's citizens, assure peace with Syria's neighbors, develop Syria's economy, and result in good faith cooperation with the international community. These things may take time, but if the Syrian authorities march forward in a deliberate way and coordinate with us on the way forward, I'm confident that we can build a stronger and more confident relationship. We will consider sanctions relief, provided the interim authorities take demonstrable steps in the directions that I have articulated. We want Syria to have a second chance. Del, thank you again for the kind invitation to join you. We encourage the involvement of all Syrians in rebuilding their country. I love meeting with Syrian Americans who are so passionate about the future. I was at the Doha Forum on December 8th when Assad fled the country. There were, on one side of the room was a very quiet Iranian delegation, and they went home early from Doha. But on the other side was a room of very tearful and euphoric Syrians. And it was just an incredible moment to be with them. Thank you.
Tim, you're so welcome, and we can't tell you how much we appreciate your involvement in our collaborative conversation today. I mean, it's not only your depth of knowledge and your experience in the region, but what comes through is your true passion for your mission and for the people that you address over there. And we can't thank you enough for it. At this point, we're going to turn to our discussion, and you're going to be hearing through our moderator, who I'm going to introduce in a second, but you're going to be hearing from folks that we couldn't find more qualified individuals, and Ambassador Robert Ford, as Tim mentioned, who has recently, who was the past ambassador for Syria, our very own Dr. Fadi Halani, Carolyn Rose, and Dr. Neil Quillam, who you will be hearing more from and about after I introduce our moderator for our discussion. Let me turn the floor over to Dr. William Lawrence. Dr. Lawrence is a senior academic fellow in residence at the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations, and he's also director specifically of our North Africa programming. I want to thank you all in advance for joining our discussion, and I will now hand it over to you, Dr. Lawrence.
Thank you, Del. And I'd like to thank Tim again for such important and timely remarks, which we don't really hear often enough, as I'm sure you know, from the department. And I'd like to take your offer, Tim, to just answer a couple of questions now at this point in our program, because we know you have to leave maybe sometime around 11. So I have two questions to start with. Number one, from the audience, what is the future of Russian military bases in Syria, and will Washington attempt to eliminate them or ask the Russians to leave? And the second question is connected to my own experience working on lifting Libya sanctions. As you know, sanctions are clunky and really hard to remove. And we talk about lifting them, but it's not easy. And so in the context of carrots and sticks, and you want plenty as a diplomat to deploy vis-a-vis Syria, what is your thinking about how to remove sanctions in Syria? Can you suspend them without removing them? Can you not enforce them if things are going well? Can you tailor them like within a sanction and say, well, we're going to worry about this thing, but not this other thing? Is there discussion with the legal department at state about how to maybe accelerate and make less bureaucratic the lightening of sanctions on Libya without giving up the ghost, without just saying the sanctions are gone?
Yeah, good questions, Bill. Thank you. Starting with the second on sanctions, yes, there is some flexibility that can be implemented in terms of the rigor or the letter of the law to which we apply the sanctions. It was a great push for a general license 24, which was implemented in the previous regime to allow certain previous administration on our part to allow certain types of commercial activity to take place. Again, every visitor who comes through town or from the region with whom we talk about Syria notes the very dire economic situation and the recognition that the Syrian authorities have to deliver for the Syrian people, and it's a hard wedge to have to work around the strong sanctions that we have imposed. Some countries are already relinquishing or taking up moving away the sanctions that they had imposed. Some commercial activity is happening, through Jordan, Jordanian gas into Syria with the help of Qatar. We don't want to see the Syrians, experience undue stress. We realize the situation that they have inherited, while a joyful and euphoric one, is an extremely difficult one. Travelers to Damascus, and particularly outside areas, have shared with us, sort of eyewitness commentary on the welfare and well-being of the Syrian people, the very limited electricity that people have for their own purposes, but that also means hospitals and institutions which are short on power. So recognizing there's a very dire situation, and that's why I think we're very keen to see responsiveness quickly from the Syrian authorities. Again, we view the ball as in their court, essentially, and that the more they are forthcoming with us about steps that they can take, the more we can move quickly to release those sanctions and relieve some of that pressure. With the Russians, Russia's role in Syria of the last 20 years has been extremely negative, being close to the Assad regime, supporting the Assad regime. Bashar al-Assad is said to be in Russia, in fact, and some of the leadership from the previous regime has fled to Russia. I think there will be more of a conversation on this as we go forward. Right now, the priorities are along the lines of what I articulated, and foremost, when we look at outside powers, the Iranians in particular are seen by this administration, as you know, as playing a much more diabolical role in terms of their influence with proxy groups inside the country. But I'm quite sure that over time we will take up the Russian influence in Syria with more focus.
Sorry, I'm muting myself. Thank you. Before we turn to the discussion, one last question for for Ambassador Ford. Ambassador Ford, do you have any questions for the Senior Bureau official, Tim Lenderking? I know you're friends and former colleagues at State. Did you have a question for him before we switch over to the rest of the discussion?
Thank you for that, Bill. Nice to see you and nice to see everyone. Tim, nice to see you. You indicated, Tim, that there might be some flexibility in terms of the way the Americans approach sanctions and sanctions relief and Damascus. My question to you is, do you think the Syrians understand that flexibility? Do you think they understand, if I can put it this way, what shorter term measures they need to take in order to get some shorter or more limited sanctions relief, while longer term measures would deliver broader sanctions relief? Do they understand what you expect of them? My impression, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Trump administration's engagement with the Syrian authorities is very limited. The foreign minister is coming this weekend, and I understand he's not even leaving New York.
Yeah, that's right. He's applied for visas and will come to New York. Some members of the delegation will come for World Bank, IMF meetings. But we have contact with the foreign minister, and those sort of steps that I outlined, I think, have been clearly spelled out. I would be surprised if they understood the intricacies of sanctions. And the way that we have set the terms of this engagement is that as they take steps and articulate and do things that we've asked them to do, that builds the relationship. That allows us to have a broader dialogue. So I think I certainly hear your point on what the level of what they may or may not understand, but I think we're looking to them to work this relationship such that we can broaden the conversation, but it's based on actions. It's going to be based on actions.
Thank you, Tim, for those three answers. Now on to Ambassador Ford. Robert Ford finished a 30-year career as the last ambassador to Syria. He received the John F. Kennedy Library Profile and Courage Award in 2012 for his stout defense of human rights in Syria as the civil war expanded. Prior to work in Syria, Ford was the U.S. ambassador to Algeria, where he boosted bilateral relations with new education and rule of law programs. And I had a pleasure of staying the better part of a week at his residence in Algeria, and very memorable in 2013. Ford made 2 visits to opposition-held areas of northwest Syria in 2023 and spent 2 weeks in Syria in late January of this year. He's met the new Syrian president, Ahmed Shara, 3 times since 2023 for extended discussions. And in January, he spent 4 days with the leadership of the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Autonomous Administration in northeast Syria as well. He'll share some of his ideas about how to manage our relationship with Syria going forward. And then a little more of his background as a diplomat. He also served in Iraq for 5 years. During the war there, served as the ambassador's top political advisor and then deputy ambassador, helping Iraqis stand up their permanent government after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Ford also worked in Bahrain, Egypt, and was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco, as was I, before joining the Foreign Service, as did I. I followed in his footsteps. In 2014, he received the from John Kerry, the State Department's Distinguished Service Award, the department's highest award. After retirement in 2014, he taught at Johns Hopkins and then 8 years at Yale. He's speaking to us from Yale University, where he is giving guest lectures today and appears regularly in American, European, and Arab media, ranging from NPR to BBC, The Washington Post, Foreign Affairs Magazine, The Atlantic. He occasionally gives live interviews in Arabic cable television or satellite television as well. The floor is yours, Ambassador Ford.
Thanks, Bill. And again, thank you for the invitation to you and to Fadi, and nice to be with this group. I'm just going to say a few things because I think question and answer for this group is a much better format. So, so I just heard Tim enumerate a series of American asks of the Damascus government. And I hope, I am not at all sure, I hope that the Syrian government understands that some of the asks are easier than others, and there will be American reciprocal steps when Damascus takes a relatively easy, shorter term step. Not sure that they understand. I hope they do. I think it would be a real tragedy if the foreign minister comes to New York. The foreign minister is Ahmed Shah's #1 political aide. There's no one even close, as best I can tell, who has that kind of influence with Shah and therefore within the government itself. It would be a real tragedy if he comes all the way to New York and he doesn't have a serious meeting with the American administration. That to me that failure to meet the foreign minister while he's here is itself a message from the Trump administration, which is, we're not interested in talking to you until you take steps first. That is not sending a message of reciprocity. So we'll see how it goes. I'm going to just say a few things about Shah himself. I've spent probably a dozen hours with him since February 2023. I will share with the group that it was my idea to put him on the terrorism list in 2012. I did it for two reasons. Number one, he had direct ties to Al-Qaeda in Iraq and to Ayad Baghdadi and to bad people like Abu Musab Zarqawi. And we saw him beginning to do car bombs in Damascus itself in late 2011 and going into 2012. And so he was a bad guy. We actually had to close the American embassy in 2012, not because of anything that the Assad government was threatening us with, but because we had very good intelligence that the Nusra Front was targeting us. And the Syrian government was not willing to take the steps necessary to give the embassy adequate setback by closing the road in front of the embassy. So that's why we closed. I actually told that to Shah once, and he made no response. I said, it's because of you we had to close the embassy. He didn't say anything. So what I would also say about him is when I met him in March of 2023, I went with a British non-government organization that specializes in conflict resolution. He told me then that he understood, after having governed the province of Idlib for several years, that he understood that the violence and the violent tactics that he used in liberation of areas from government control or in fighting the Americans in Iraq, he was blunt about it, were not appropriate for someone who's actually must govern a space with 4 million people in it, 2 million Idlibi residents, and then 2 million refugees, displaced people. And that his concept of how to manage a government had evolved, and that politics was clearly more important once you're governing than the use of violence per se. When I met him subsequently in September of 2023, and we were talking about government in Syria someday, and I was talking about a coalition government, it didn't occur to me that he'd ever actually get to Damascus. But he said, look, he said, we understand that governing in Idlib, which is a conservative society and heavily dominated by Sunni Muslims, that conservative society, governance there has to be different from what it would be when we get to Damascus and have to govern cities like Homs and Damascus, where there's much greater diversity in terms of religion and in terms of groups, whether they be Druze or Alawi or whatever. He said, Idlib is not the model that we would follow when we govern all of Syria. That said, I don't think for a moment he's a Democrat at heart. He's very authoritarian. I asked him in 2023, how come we don't allow the Itilaf, the coalition of opposition forces, to open an office in Idlib? Would you ever consider it? He said, well, maybe one day, but the time's not right now. When I tried to pin him down on what circumstances would make it appropriate, he would never give an answer. And we saw how he reacted to anti-HTS demonstrations in Idlib in 2023, 2024. So I don't think he's a Democrat. My only question going forward is, will people who are more liberal, and I don't mean left and right, I mean liberal as opposed to religiously oriented for government, will Syrian liberals get space so that they themselves can organize and provide a serious opposition to him over time? I think that the jury is still out on that, but my own experience in January was that there was plenty of freedom of speech, quite remarkable. And just to share an anecdote, routinely when I would go into a cafe, and we were there long enough that I actually could go into cafes and sit and chat, and many people knew who I was. That really surprised me, but they did. And when we'd be talking, complete strangers, people I certainly didn't know, and I don't think the people I was talking to knew necessarily, would join the conversation, and we'd be talking about what's going on in Syria, or what the prospects are, how the Christian community felt. We were in Babtuman, so there were many Christians right there. And they were very critical of Shara very openly in a way that you certainly didn't see during the time of the Assad regime. So, and there were protests in downtown Damascus while we were there. There was both civil society groups who were saying we don't want restrictions on civil society, and there were also people protesting that they hadn't been paid, government employees. And the police stood back. I mean, they were there, but they didn't shoot, they didn't arrest, it was a much more restrained response, frankly, than the people in Idlib got in 2023 and 2024. So I don't know how this will turn out in terms of democratic principles. But I think the jury is out, and it's not impossible that over time things can be, how would I say this, anchored into Syrian political society. Every day that there's not restrictions put in place is a good day, is a day that helps anchor. Last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to shut up. I went up to El Hasakeh and met with the Autonomous Administration and the Syrian Democratic Forces. I'm going to be very blunt. The Syrian Democratic Forces are really the YPG Syrian militia with some Arab fighters, but the commanders are all from the YPG or Kandil from the PKK. And we need to be blunt about that. I find this American insistence on calling them always the Syrian Democratic Forces actually obscures the problem. Frankly, the British group that I was with when we went in January, that was what we were trying to do, is get a conversation, negotiation started between Damascus and the YPG, the PYD, and its autonomous administration. So I was glad to see the agreement in March. The integration that is in that agreement between President Shara and Mr. Mazloum al-Abdi, notice that, calls for the integration of the fighters of the Syrian Democratic Forces, Kurds and Arabs, into the new Syrian army. And it also calls for the integration of the autonomous administration into the Syrian government. It's nice to write that on a piece of paper. I cannot imagine how that is actually going to work on the ground. And I'll share an anecdote. Mazloum Abdi, I was chatting with him, he's very personable, I must say, commented to me that there's now going to be an Islamic component of training in the Syrian Arab Army, Ahmed Shara and HTS's new Syrian army. And he said, our fighters, and especially our women fighters, are not going to sit through training in Islam to be part of the Syrian Arab Army. I mean, well, not even, he wouldn't use the word Arab, he'd just say the Syrian army, the new Syrian army. They will not. That's just a small taste of the difficulty involved, and how that integration would be done, whether it be done at the level of, say, a platoon or a company or an individual fighter, and how commanders from the YPG would be given commands in the new Syrian army. I don't think they themselves know on either side. And then integrating the autonomous administration into the government will be just as hard. And I spent a day going around Hasakeh and Raqqa looking at the structures of the autonomous administration. And I have to admit, I had not understood until that trip how developed they are, both in terms of bureaucratic structures, but they've also redone the map. So out of 3 provinces, the PYD and the autonomous administration created 7. And each of them has its own bureaucratic structures and its own legislative councils and structures. And so dismantling that and going back to the original 3 provinces, which I think is what Ahmed Shara is thinking about, is going to involve a lot of job losses and changes in who is the boss of whom. It's going to be much more complicated than just integrating. Integrating is not the right word. So I think there are all kinds of pitfalls in this. The Americans are smack dab in the middle of it because they've always supported the PYD and the YPG, either directly or indirectly. There are reports, I don't know if they're true, I didn't ask Tim, that the Americans are now withdrawing some forces and may go down to from 2,000 down even to 500. But the air cover is the most important thing, and as I understand it, that is still going to be there. I don't think Ahmed Shara wants to fight the Syrian Democratic Forces. I don't think he wants to fight the YPG. I don't think he really wants to fight anyone. I think he wants to gradually absorb and swallow other groups, but in a very gradual way, not unlike the way he contained and then swallowed, absorbed fighting groups in Idlib that the Americans and the CIA were supporting back in 2014, 2015, 2016. I think that's his model, but I don't know how he's going to do it with the YPG. That's a different kettle of fish. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks again, Bill and Fadi, for the invitation.
Thank you, Ambassador Ford. And boy, what a treat for us to hear what it's like right up front. And these conversations, you told us just so much there. And I've got about 15 questions I'm not going to ask because the only way to get to questions is to get through the panel. So I'm going to jump right into the next speaker. Dr. Fadi Hilani, my colleague at the Council, is the Senior Academic and Research Fellow in Residence. He's a distinguished scholar of linguistics and Middle East policy. He taught at Aleppo University in Syria, Isra University in Jordan, Montclair State University in New Jersey, and the City University of New York. His expertise extends to foreign policy in the Middle East, including strategic, cultural, political dimensions that shape American engagement with Arab countries. Drawing on his deep regional knowledge and linguistic background, he brings a nuanced understanding to how language, identity, and policy intersect in shaping U.S. interactions on the Arab world. Dr. Fadi, the floor is yours. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Bill, for the introduction. It's always great to be, of course, part of this very esteemed panel. I will try to be very brief with the hope that, of course, I can possibly prompt questions and answers. So I will leave possibly most of what I would like to say for the Q&A. So what I would like to very quickly refer to are some of the challenges ahead to Syria. Everybody knows about the past, the last 14 years when the Syrian revolution started in 2011, how, of course, Assad tried to actually suppress the revolution with his Russian and Iranian allies, and how, of course, it escalated, and how there were like provinces in the northwest which belonged to the opposition, and how the government controlled the central of Syria, of course, and the SDF was in the northeast. So very well known, of course, kind of review of Syria's past in the last 14 years. But what I would like to try to focus on in my remarks briefly, hopefully, are the challenges laying ahead. So the transition which happened in Syria, the collapse of the Assad regime, did not happen through a political settlement, as everybody knows. It happened through a coordinated military offensive. So we can think about a power vacuum in Damascus, in Syria in general. But that power vacuum was quickly filled in by, of course, the armed opposition, which was led by HTS, And as, of course, Ambassador Ford and Mr. Lenderking, of course, referred to, HTS is categorized as a terrorist organization in the United States. So this puts ahead a number of complexities for Syria's future. If I want to break down these complexities, these challenges, I would refer briefly to three of these challenges. And I know there are, of course, much more challenges to talk about. So the first one I would like to refer to is the security challenge. Having the transition in Syria happening through the collapse of a regime, not through a political transition, that, of course, entailed the collapse of the Syrian army, the police, the security forces. So obviously there has been a security issue in Syria. In my hometown in Aleppo, for example, when I speak to family members, they tell me literally there is no police in the streets. Especially following the first few weeks after the collapse of the regime. We know that there had been like a lot of theft incidents, a lot of incidents in Aleppo. People have been complaining about the lack of security. So people were concerned about sending their kids to schools, for example. So there were a lot of concerns concerning security, the police, so on and so forth. And that is one aspect of the whole thing. Another aspect had to do with, of course, we know in March what happened in the Alawite villages in the, of course, west coast of Syria. And it's very well known that it was triggered by insurgency from the remnants of the Assad regime, no doubt. But there were reported incidents of course, violence committed by the security forces themselves, the government, the new government forces, if you will. And these were attributed to uncontrolled fighters. And I'm quoting here many of the government resources in Syria who admitted the fact that some of this violence was committed by government forces, but unfortunately they did not have control over them. And we know many of these uncontrolled fighters are actually non-Syrian foreign fighters operating on the ground. And this is one of the obstacles, obviously, between the new government in Syria and the United States. So the uncontrolled fighters is another aspect of challenge for security in Syria. The Syria government says that they have been there for a long time. They understand, of course, how to operate in Syria. But obviously, there is no reason why you can think that your police, for example, or army is a non-Syrian fighter. And with that concern in mind, I would refer here to something very quickly. The constitutional declaration, which mentioned that the president should be a Muslim, for example, and spoke about the president, did not mention anything about the nationality of the president, that he has to be, for example, a Syrian born, or he has to be, for example, from a Syrian father or a mother. And that raises concerns that possibly, like, would there be a possibility for one of these foreign fighters, for example, to become a president if anything happens to Shara, for example, or any of these consequences, which you can think about when you think about factions within, of course, the military organizations which are operating on the ground in Syria now. Another security challenge, and that is the third aspect of security, which I would like to refer to here, is ISIS. So obviously there has been, of course, reports citing that there has been, especially after the collapse of the Assad regime and the last few weeks, resurgence of ISIS fighters who are taking opportunity of this power vacuum I'm trying to refer to, of course, regroup and try to, of course, operate on the ground. There have been some reports from non, of course, government organizations in the UK saying that the 1,000 fighters that are known about in the Syrian Badia, for example, have disappeared. And this is raising concerns that these fighters are obviously now in cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and possibly they are planning for something. And this may possibly connect to some of the intelligence reports from the U.S. saying that there is a possibility, highly possibility, for some kind of violence in Syria in the coming days. We all heard from the State Department this statement a few days ago about warning U.S. citizens in Syria that there could be some violence in the few coming days. So there is very much concern about ISIS, who can, of course, fight ISIS with, of course, the lack of enough police, if you will, and security forces on the ground operating in Syria. Other than the security challenge, another challenge, of course, is in front of Syria now is the regional power competition, which we know very well was already there before the collapse of the Assad regime, but now it's actually taking a different shape after the collapse of the regime and with the new Syrian government. We know that the two forces, one of the major forces or actors, regional actors on the ground, is Turkey. Turkey, before the collapse of the Assad regime, backed the opposition. Obviously, it did not green light the insurgency, the military operation, which resulted in the collapse of the Assad regime. But there was a clear Turkish backing of the operation. So they did not try to stop it. They did not try to give a red light to HTS and the other opposition groups. They did so a few months earlier. And I heard from different people who actually are close to the Turkish administration that while the war in Gaza was going on and in Lebanon, there was a clear red Turkish light for opposition forces to advance beyond Idlib. This red light was not there after the ceasefire in Lebanon in around November in 2024. So there was no green light, but at the same time, there was no red light, which was given before, of course. So Turkey is a main regional actor in Syria, no doubt. There have been plans, negotiations for Turkey to establish military bases in central Syria, but these have raised major concerns with the Israelis. Israel feels that any Turkish military existence on Syria is going to threaten their national security. Their argument is that if this happens, there could be, in the past, there was like a resistance axis, an Iranian axis. Now there will be what they are referring to a Muslim Brotherhood axis, which is going to extend, as they say, from Turkey, Syria, to Jordan in a way, and of course to Gaza. And that is the argument they are making. So there are two major forces playing on the ground in Syria, Turkey and the Israelis. Out of this concern, the Israelis have actually extended their occupation of the Golan Heights, going beyond, of course. We know that they are, according to the last reports I heard, they are 25 kilometers from Damascus. They occupied most of Quneitra, of course, parts of Daraa. There have been some clashes with citizens. So that is a major concern. We know that the Israelis and the Turkish leadership, they had a round of negotiations, which many people said they were not very successful, to try to reach a settlement like dividing power in Syria. But that is a very major obstacle when we want to think and talk about Syrian sovereignty on the ground, with regional power, of course, dividing areas of dominance amongst themselves. Talking about Turkey and Israel, we should not, of course, forget about two other very much active actors, I will say. The first are the Russians. They have their military bases, of course, in Ahmimim, and they have, of course, a port in Tartus. They want to keep these two, I will say, Russian footholds in Syria. They are trying to negotiate with this with Shara. Obviously, Shara is not so far, to the best of my understanding, against a Russian military existence in Syria, but he wants to make it like part of a deal package with the Russians. The last statements from Shara is that there has been a very long-standing relationship, militarily speaking, with the Russians, and economically, we should make the best of this relationship. So obviously, there is something ahead, working out with the Russians. But another one also I would like to refer to very quickly here is Iran. So Iran obviously lost a foothold in Syria with the collapse of its ally, Bashar al-Assad. And Syria was mainly an Iranian corridor to send weapons to Hezbollah, obviously, in that sense. Hezbollah lastly tried to maintain a foothold very close to, of course, the border with Lebanon. There were clashes with the Syrian forces, but of course, we don't expect this to be the last one, because Hezbollah is trying to maintain, and also Iran is trying to maintain a foothold in Syria where it can keep that corridor active, and they can still be sending Hezbollah some weapons so they can remain, of course, some leverage in the country. The last, and I know it's not the last one, but the last one on my list, which I will leave the rest for the, of course, for the questions and the answer. The last challenge in front of Syria is re-engaging with, of course, the international community. And here I would like to, of course, highlight re-engaging with the United States. So obviously there have been no major obstacles in front of the Syrian government re-engaging with the Arab world. The Arab Gulf countries have been very welcoming, especially Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and lastly, of course, the UAE, with the UAE president, of course, welcoming Ashara in Abu Dhabi. And also Europeans seem to be quite more open, I will say, to the Syrian and EU leadership, removing sanctions, though, of course, in a phased-out model, I will say. But the major obstacle which remains, in my opinion, also regarding re-engaging with the international community, has to do with the United States. There have been a list of demands which the U.S. administration sent to the new Syrian government. Some of them are very much doable, as the Syrian government stated, but some of them require negotiation. In my opinion, one of the very major obstacles, and that is the one I referred to in my remarks on the security challenge, has to do with the foreign fighters. Shara himself, his foreign minister, are still listed as terrorists, and many of these foreign fighters as well. How the new Syrian government is going to reframe its army and work out with those non-Syrian foreign fighters is going to be one of the major questions which the government has to answer as much as it's approaching its recalibrating, I will say, its relationship with the United States. I will stop here and I will leave the rest for the questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadi, for your very helpful and heartfelt comments. I would ask that the audience send all questions by email to questions@nkusar.org. That's questions@ncusar.org, questions@nkusar.org. Our next speaker is Caroline Rose, who is Director of the Crime, Conflict, Nexus, and Military Withdrawals Portfolios at New Lines Institute, where she leads and produces research on the intersection of defense, security, illicit trades, and geopolitical landscapes. She's also served as an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University, teaching a graduate course on the nexus of illicit economies, armed conflict, and security. She's also a recipient of the Middle East Policy Center's 2025 40 Under 40 Awards. Prior to joining New Lines, she was an analyst at forecasting firm and publication Geopolitical Futures, where she worked on political, economic, and defense developments in the Middle East and Europe with a focus on the Mediterranean and the Levant. She also served as a research associate for the LSE International Drug Policy Unit's Middle East Initiative. She's repeatedly briefed U.S. and allied ministries, intelligence agencies, embassies, and legislative bodies on the Captagon drug trade and insecurity in the Middle East and their effects on U.S. and partner interests. She's also authored several reports and advised organizations like the UN Office for Drugs and Crime, UNODC, and the European Union, offering expertise on the crime conflict nexus and synthetic drug trades in the Middle East. She also testified before the British Parliament on Captagon. Her commentary and work on defense issues and security challenges, geopolitical developments, are widely featured in every media organization you can think of. She holds a Master in Science and International History from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a Bachelor in Arts in International Studies from the American University School of International Service, where I used to teach. But the most important part of her bio, which is not in there, is she was an intern at the National Council on U.S. Arab Affairs, and we hope that she refers to that at the beginning of her remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, William. Thank you so much, Fadi. Thank you to the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here. It's very special, as you just mentioned, William. I interned for NCUSAR actually in high school. I took the metro. I took a car, then a metro out from Purcellville, Virginia every day for a few months. It was a great experience. I'm also a graduate of the Model Arab League program. I still have a Model Arab League t-shirt in like mustard yellow that I still wear. It's a really great program that you guys are running, and I'm very, very pleased and excited to talk about Syria. I share a lot of the concerns that speakers have made about the risks that we're seeing in Syria, but I also want to bring a bit of optimism in the sense of I think there's so much opportunity in Syria that we're seeing right now. We witnessed an event in early December that so many analysts and experts just never expected, and it had been the fall of the Assad regime. And while, of course, it has introduced many risks and concerns inside of Syria, but gosh, it's wonderful to see so much opportunity in a country that experienced over a decade of civil war. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity that the United States can build momentum for in the coming days. And I was really pleased to hear Mr. Lenderking's outline of the expectations that the United States has. I think that, and I remarked this on social media, I think that it's actually one of the most specific lists that we've seen thus far in terms of what we're expecting from the new interim government. And I'm very encouraged by this list becoming more specific, seeing more clarity, seeing timelines and additional specifications, because I share Ambassador Ford's concerns about seeing that mutual appreciation and understanding within the interim government. I don't want to I want to keep my remarks somewhat short and abridged, because I know that there are a few questions, but I want to talk about the opportunities that we're seeing, but also the obstacles that are ahead. As I mentioned, I think that we rarely get to see these sorts of opportunities geopolitically and throughout history. When the regime fell in Syria, I started to think about different post-war models, such as, for example, what we saw in post-war Germany, post-war Japan, and opportunities to build out civil society, to engage with academic institutions, to engage with governance institutions inside of Syria. And really, I think it's important that the international community recognize the importance of timing here. There's momentum to build upon. And while the interim government has very amazingly kept the general state of security together in many ways, there are a lot of risks and risks and oversights that I think the international community can help contribute to and try and stave against. We've seen, of course, Foreign Minister Assad al-Shabani. He's engaged in this impressive series of shuttle diplomacy efforts. But of course, now we're starting to see this termination of that honeymoon period. And there are now obstacles that are becoming more and more apparent. So there are four main challenges that I perceive in Syria at the moment. Number one is defining the state's external legitimacy. Number two is defining the state's internal credibility. Number three is establishing order and sustaining momentum. And then finally, looking at external threats posed by outside actors. I'll start with number one, the external legitimacy component. We've seen some progress, the establishment of embassies, delegations visiting Syria, what feels like every half hour. Shabani has now been to Paris, Rome. He's going to be in New York this Friday at the United Nations. We've also seen reconstruction deals, as well as, of course, commitments from countries like Saudi Arabia to resolve Syria's World Bank debt of around 15 million. That being said, we're starting to see some frustration and impatience about the lack of sanctions relief and economic relief into Syria, particularly from Syrians themselves. And I think that timing is going to be very important, because this, of course, can create challenges in the second arena, the second challenge that I'll outline, which is internal credibility. We, of course, have seen Ahmed al-Shara's quick rise through HGS offensive that, of course, took all of Damascus all the way from Idlib. But however, that being said, there's still a fight for legitimacy and credibility at home. The violence that we saw ensue along Syria's coast in Latakia a few months ago, I think that that represented a key blight in the credibility of al-Shara, both internationally, but also internally. And if you talk to religious leaders throughout Syria of minority communities, if you talk to officials in Syria's northeast, they'll reference to the violence that occurred along the coast in Latakia as an example of what could happen, of course, if al-Shara loses control over some more radical elements that are still embedded in HGS, such as the foreign fighters that we saw participate in some of these clashes. Additionally, I think that there's been quite a bit of frustration over the delay and the process of this internal investigation into the violence that occurred in Latakia. And as Mr. Lenderking mentioned too, there is a desire for accountability and, of course, the role of justice and accountability as this investigation moves forward. There's also frustration within the community about disappeared persons and a lack of movement when it comes to identifying information about individuals that disappeared in, for example, the Palestine branch at Sednaya prison. There was notably some frustration from community members when al-Shara met with Deborah Tice, the mother of Austin Tice. But again, there's been slowed progress on trying to identify the many Syrians that disappeared at the hands of the Assad regime. And I think that that's something that al-Shara is trying to make progress on. But of course, with so many different priorities, it's been something that is representing a greater challenge, especially amongst Syrian civil society communities. And then lastly, there's rampant frustration and impatience with the economic situation. They've seen Shaibani and al-Shara busy as ever. They're, jetting all over the region. They're engaging with many external stakeholders. And while there's been progress on paper, they're not necessarily seeing this actual create new different realities inside of Syria in terms of its economic situation. And so I think that this is something that certainly has created a greater atmosphere of frustration and impatience with the pace of this economic campaign to try and relieve sanctions. Thirdly, establishing order and sustaining momentum. I think that we've seen a series of violent outbreaks that create a lot of cause for concern. We've seen violence in the south, along the border with Lebanon, between Syrian forces, as well as, of course, smuggling networks that have kidnapped Syrian soldiers. They've also launched strikes into southern Syria. That is something that I think represents this new interim government's inability to try and consolidate control over the border, as well as, of course, rein in the role and rein in the influence of smuggling groups that have engaged in illicit trades like Captagon and methamphetamine and hashish smuggling. That is definitely a challenge for al-Shara, and that's going to take quite a lot of time to try and consolidate momentum in creating that command and control. Additionally, and as I mentioned before, we had the violence along the coast that delayed intervention from the Syrian interim government. That certainly is something that has represented a challenge for internal control over its forces. And then finally, and as Ambassador Ford mentioned, and I completely share his concerns with this, it's the integration of the SDF. The SDC is, of course, terrified about what happened in Latakia, and this has raised many concerns about shared principles and values of governance, how this integration is going to work, whether the SDC is going to be able to retain this autonomous status in the Northeast. And when it comes to the SDF, there are similar concerns there as well. There have been a lot of models that have been thrown out. Some have referred to, for example, the KRG model in Iraq. And trying to establish some sort of special forces like the Kurdish Security Forces, the KSF, for the SDF. I personally think that there will be a lot of challenges in that model, and that the year-long negotiation process that we're about to see, there are a lot of areas where we could see negotiation sour or potentially break down. And that is definitely something that I think needs continued engagement and monitoring from the international community. And then finally, I'll end off with this. We've got external threats as well. Not only is the interim government battling internal security and credibility and legitimacy and trying to build up momentum there, but additionally, they're facing repeated strikes from Israel along the Golan and in the south. Additionally, if the agreement between the PKK and Turkey breaks down in the northeast, we could potentially see some Turkish activity in the northeast and some potential violence, of course, with Kurdish elements in the northeast. And of course, ISIS. I think that that's the other elephant in the room. ISIS, of course, had some increased activity throughout 2023 and 2024. While their attacks were not sophisticated, they are looking for moments to exploit this insecurity and distraction. And that's certainly something that I think that the interim government is concerned about. They're trying to build momentum, but without substantial international engagement and support there, it's going to be very difficult for them to battle that threat itself. And I'll leave off my comments there.
Thank you, Caroline Rose. Like the previous speaker, so much to chew on there. And to start that process, I'm asking the audience to send your questions to questions@necusar.org. That's questions@ncusar.org, questions@necusar.org. And to continue to chew on all that's been put out there by the previous speakers. We're now going to turn to our final speaker, Neil Quilliam. Not the first time he's been with us either. He's an energy policy, geopolitics, and foreign affairs specialist with extensive knowledge and experience of the Middle East and North Africa region. He's energy research director at the SRMG think tank and partner at Israel Strategy Consulting. Previously headed the Chatham House MENA program's Future Dynamics in the Gulf project and was project director of Syria and its neighbors policy initiative and acting program head. He also served as senior MENA energy advisor at Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the British government, FCO, and senior MENA analyst at Control Risks, where I used to work with him, and senior program officer at the United Nations University in Amman. With that, unmute yourself, Neil, and the floor is yours. And I can invite you to plug your book as well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate again in a very good discussion on Syria. I was thinking, gosh, I mean, so much has been covered. I'm not sure how I can, find some holes or some gaps to contribute, but I thought I might dwell just for a few moments, and I won't take my full allotment of time. Just to dwell for a few moments on some of the positives that we might see or that we are seeing. I think Caroline sort of highlighted it's good to point out some of those things. But before I do, I constantly hear, and it's right, this is a unique moment. This is, it's very rare for a country to find itself in this position where, it can reset, it can almost sort of recreate itself. But I do think, and I always tell my colleagues that, timing and sequencing is everything. And a common message I hear in all of these discussions, everyone is basically waiting for the US. We know what the US conditions are, and we know what the Syrians have to do to achieve that. And I thought that's why it's very important that Ambassador Ford was raising that. To what extent, does the Syrian government understand that nuance or where that flexibility is? But everyone is sat on the side, essentially waiting for the US to come in. But I don't want to talk about the US now. I want to sort of, our topic is dilemmas and diplomacy. And I sort of want to talk a little bit about dilemmas and diplomacy, but from the Gulf states. I thought the Gulf states haven't been covered too much, so perhaps I could just sort of bring in a little bit of conversation around there. I mean, it won't be lost on any of our audience that, the Gulf states, actually all 6 Gulf states, but UAE, Saudi, Qatar, actually Oman too, are very actively engaged in diplomacy across the region and externally to the region. We've seen them play a much more active and engaged role in the diplomatic space, actually for the past decade. But the past few years and the past few months, we've really seen that speed up, and diplomatic traffic, particularly between the Gulf states and Syria, has just really taken off. There was a time back when I worked at Control Risks, I would cover the Gulf states and I would cover Syria, and this was prior to 2009, and my desk was quiet most of the time. It was really hard to find anything interesting to say. My colleagues looking at other regions of the world were really active. Now, I mean, it's hard to keep up on a daily basis. Just Caroline, you mentioned the meetings, the travel that Shara Shaybani are making, and those inward visits are just really, really kind of tremendous. And so the Gulf states are really sort of, I guess they've learned their lessons from Iraq, where to a large extent they sat out and they didn't want to engage. They do see this as an opportunity, and I see the three states themselves are seeing this as a moment when, yes, there's a dilemma for more of a dilemma for the Emiratis, but the Saudis have sort of come to terms with this, that they need to do this, and the Qataris were straight in to support the new interim government. And I would describe it and almost like a bear hug. It's a moment when this opportunity has to be seized. This new interim government needs to be supported. Timing and sequence is everything. The Europeans are slowly coming to the table. The US has set out its demands, but I don't think the Gulf states want to miss out on this. The Qataris have really sort of stepped in quite big time, sort of diplomatically. They're supporting on the energy front through gas, through electricity. We saw, I think it was last week, the ISF was in town to work on police and the policing and on the security framework. They're supporting on very practical ways in terms of the media. So Qatar is really kind of taking that lead. I think we need to see that as a positive development. The Saudis likewise are sort of caught up. We've seen the high-level visits. We've seen the Saudis being very supportive at the World Bank meetings. It's not just, I mean, it is forgiving that debt of 15 million, but also convening the meetings with the Syrians. So very much sort of inserting themselves into that space. We've seen a series of health and medical delegations going over. We've seen increasing humanitarian support. So those two countries are really stepping in, and the UAE has restored, obviously it's restored its full diplomatic mission. A little bit more difficult because it had done so with the with the Emiratis, with the Assad regime, but nonetheless, it's started to step up that engagement. It's received Al-Shara too, and I mean, flights will soon start to take place from Damascus to Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Sharjah. So we've seen those three states really sort of step up and move into that space. I won't sort of elaborate on that anymore. I'm very happy to do so. But I mean, two things to say about this. One is, I think for the time being, it's a little bit, I guess you use that term kumbaya. I think all the Gulf states are quite happy, quite comfortable. There's a new kind of positivity from them all about working together. There's a lot of complementary with an eye exchanges between all the states. But at heart, Qatar and the Emirates do have very different visions for the region. And no matter how those relations have been patched over, they do see, I think, the future of the region in differing ways. And I think if too much time is allowed to pass, if the US and the Syrian interim government don't manage to find a way to sort of bridge that sanctions gap and get that money in, then I think 6 months, 9 months down the line, we will start to see competition between Qatar and the UAE, and I don't see that as a positive development at all. So timing around that piece is everything. And then just to sort of finish with one comment, you know, Saudi, Emiratis, and the Qataris are not going to support a democratic process in Syria whatsoever. It's not in their interest. It's not on their, you know, on their agenda. We've seen the sort of democratic experiment in the Gulf, you know, close. So their engagement at the moment is very positive. But if the US or if the European states want to sort of push forward with an inclusive government that has a democratic underpinning and capitalizes upon those daily gains that Ambassador Ford said, then they really need to get in there and make sure that takes place before all those democratic avenues are closed down. And I'll just finish with that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. Again, a very rich presentation and so much we can ask you. Let me turn straight to the discussion. I have two questions for you, Ambassador Ford. The first one is there anything that the other speakers after you said that prompt you to respond or elaborate or provoke a thought in your mind? And the second question is, could you briefly sort of assess or critique the U.S. foreign policy towards Syria over the last decade or so, you know, and maybe things we should have gotten better or need to be thinking about now from our experience of the last 10 years after your service?
Well, all of the discussions were really good and really detailed from Fadi, Carolyn, and Neil. One of the things I liked a lot about Fadi's presentation is he talked about life outside of Damascus, and I think it's really important for everyone to understand that Syria is not just Damascus. It's easy to get focused on Damascus, but in fact, there are whole parts of the country that are going to matter politically. Aleppo is certainly one of them. Northeast Syria is another, and we need to keep those factors in mind. I'm a little surprised we haven't discussed more the whole issue of Northeast Syria, and maybe we'll get into that during the question and answer, because there are really two large organized armed groups in Syria right now, the YPG/SDF and HTS and allied groups out of Damascus. And I was really fascinated by Neil's discussion about the Gulf, because I'm watching the Emirati position with great interest. And Neil, you seem to accent kind of Emiratis and Doha, but I also wonder if there isn't an element of Emirati-Saudi competition. But in any case, my understanding for years has been that Abu Dhabi is very uncomfortable, I'm being polite, with Islamists in positions of power in governments, wherever they may be. And so this situation in Damascus, I cannot imagine is really what Abu Dhabi was hoping for. Abu Dhabi could be really helpful to Damascus in many ways, but I'm not sure in the end it will be. And so I kind of leave that out there because I don't understand Abu Dhabi nearly as well as Neil does. With respect to U.S. foreign policy, I would just say two things. Number one, many people think the Americans could fix the Syria problem, and that dates back to when I was the ambassador on the ground there in 2011 and 2012. The solution to Syria's problems with governance and management of the country never, I want to underline that word, never rested with the United States. And we are kidding ourselves, even now in 2025, if we think that the solution to whatever is going to happen in Syria is going to come from Washington. I think Washington will have a role, obviously, sanctions right at the top, and northeastern Syria next. But the solution is not solely in the hands of Washington. Frankly, Syrians have agency, and if we learn nothing else from the December 2024 blitzkrieg that brought down the Assad government, it's that Syrians have agency. The second comment I would just make is related to that. It was a mantra. It was like an ideology. It was a test of faith When I was working on Syria at the beginning of the Civil War, and long after I left, during the Trump administration and then the Biden administration, that there was no military solution to the Syrian civil war, that it had to be eventually a political outcome, a political resolution. Well, that too was wrong. And in the end, there was a military solution. And that's why I think it's important to look at a variety of factors with respect to Syria right now. But I think most important is to sort of watch what is happening with different armed groups, whether they be Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS and his fighters, or the YPG/SDF, or fighters under Ahmed Auda in southern Syria, south of Damascus, or whoever the group is, Druzi fighters, their militia in Sweden. So because I think that is the single most operative issue right now. The one lesson I took out of the Iraq War, where I was for 5 years, is that if you don't have security, you cannot rebuild an economy. You really can't even build much of a political process. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador Ford. That was excellent. Neil, I've got 3 questions for you. First, I'd like you to respond to anything that Ambassador Ford just said, and in particularly what he said about UAE and their allergy to anything that looks Islamist. The second one is if you could say a little bit more about more than a decade, created opportunities for Syria, of any kinds, in terms of governance or reconstruction or any of the things we care about, like, and how should we be thinking about the diaspora?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll respond to Ambassador Ford's question about the UAE and Qatar. No, absolutely. It has an allergic reaction to political Islam. We see that wherever it's operating, and that's why I kind of characterize it. The Qataris were in first, the Saudis and the Emiratis were kind of dragging their feet, but thinking, okay, we've got to engage one way or another in this process. But this is an anathema for us. It's a very difficult situation to square away, and we just need to look at their actions elsewhere in the region to understand where that sort of sits and fits. But I do think, I mean, they are at the back of the queue, if you like, but at the moment everyone's sort of holding hands a little bit and thinking, okay, we can get on. There's a strange, I find it strange, there's a strange kind of complementary positivity amongst the Gulf states at the moment, and they're all complementing one another. I'm not sure that it was there before. We know things are under the surface, but it's an interesting space. But for sure that competition will open up, and the UAE, if it doesn't get what it wants or it works where it wants, there are other groups, as you've alluded to, in the country where it may put its support. So that's very much there. Where are the Europeans? I mean, the Europeans are sort of, they're coming along. They're sort of, I would say that they're bumbling along, but they're ahead of where the US is on sanctions. There was a posting on the UK. Actually, I do consider the UK European, sorry, but on the Ministry of Defense website today, saying that asset freezes on the Syrian Defense Ministry of Defense and Interior and some intelligence agencies has been lifted, so they're no longer subject to asset freezes. So that in itself is a positive development. The conditionality behind the lifting of some of the sanctions has already come into place, is already there. We know that those sanctions can be sort of put back on. So, I mean, I think the Europeans are doing as much as they dare, but there are 27 states, and there are certain states within the EU that are dragging their feet. On a bilateral basis, it's a little bit easier, and we've seen some quite significant pledges of financial support back in March from the EU, and the UK has pledged several hundred million that is sort of putting to space. So they're coming along. still not fully there. But diplomatic activity, we've seen several European leaders traveling to Damascus, and we do see a lot of the Brussels elite moving there. In terms of the sort of Syrian diaspora, I mean, I'm delighted nearly every day. Syrians that have been living in the country, in the UK or in Europe or elsewhere, are just sort of flagging up. I'm here now. I've been back a month. This is what I'm doing, and I can only, these are sort of heartwarming stories, because I mean, who could possibly have imagined this a year ago? That so many of those brilliant and talented Syrians that we knew living outside and being educated outside are now going back and making a tremendous contribution to the country. I just about a slightly different tint onto that. I studied with some Egyptian friends years back, and most of them stayed outside and didn't return to Egypt. One or two did go back, and I would ask them, why are you going back when you can stay in the US? Or no, we want to go back. We want to build our country. It's an impossible task. We understand we're going to be tremendously frustrated, but we want to go back and do that. And now, just to see so many Syrians, so many brilliant Syrians going back, I think that's a really, really positive development. And I mean, I remember writing a piece probably about 8 or 9 years ago, when sort of, there was, when sort of anti-refugee or anti-migrant sentiment was really high in the country. And I remember putting a piece out saying, we benefited tremendously from having a lot of Iraqis come into the country, because not only do they bring a lot and they contribute to all our different systems, but they also help build these relationships between the two countries, between Iraq and the UK. And I got a lot of criticism for it, but I see that now as well with all these great Syrians that I've spent time with living here, going over, building their country. I mean, they also have their linkages and their roots to the countries where they've been, and that can only be a really positive development. Mm-hmm. And I don't think any of them are naive either. It's not that they understand the size of the struggle. So I see that as a really positive development.
Syrians are hopefully anxious and anxiously hopeful. Caroline, two interrelated questions. You and I know that the whole MENA region, since the Arab Spring and before, right, is crisscrossed with trafficking networks of all kinds, whether arms or drugs or people or, and we know Syria is going to be destabilized for this and won't be able to address it quickly enough. So what are your thoughts on how to address these transnational criminal networks, and whether that's a space in which the international community is going to have to step in, whether regional powers, global powers, is that a, without interfering in what Syrians want to do or not owning it. But I'm suspecting, even in terms of intelligence on the networks, it's sort of beyond what the Syrians can do on their own. And it's a problem yesterday and today, not a year from now. And we see the lists of things for Syria. It often doesn't include that adequately. And the interrelated question is, could you just say a little bit more about the Captagon trade? I mean, obviously people can Google it and look at how it's affecting Jordan and all the countries in Syria's region and the production of it in Syria. But what are your sort of top line thoughts on Captagon and how we need to be thinking about it in the context of the questions we're discussing today?
Certainly. And just a quick tag along to what Neil just said. I think that in the months after the regime's fall, we've seen the strength of so many Syrian civil society organizations that have been engaged on Syria, both within Syria and outside of Syria, and getting to see the work that they're conducting now, returning back to Damascus, returning back to different areas around Syria. It's been quite amazing. And to be honest, personally, I think it's one of the few things that does give me hope about the future of Syria, given that they have engaged with, different governmental stakeholders around the world. They've been active on, pressuring these governments to keep pressure on the Assad regime. They've engaged with so many of us, and just getting to see them go back and engage and bring those lessons learned, that gives me a lot of hope for the direction of Syria, because I know that they have the capacity to keep that pressure on the interim government and uphold many of the same values that they tried to uphold externally outside of Syria. So I just wanted to say that, and I think that Neil hit the nail right on the head with that. Regarding Captagon, regarding illicit streams inside of Syria and outside of Syria, we have a project over at the New Lines Institute where we run data on Captagon seizures and Captagon arrests. And we've done a lot of work on the Syrian regime's involvement in Captagon as this alternative revenue stream. At its peak, at the Captagon trade's peak, it was estimated to bring in around $10 billion annually. $2.7 billion of which were directly related to lining the pockets of Syrian regime officials, like, for example, Assad's brother, Maher al-Assad, cousins like Wassim Badi al-Assad, Samer al-Assad, and other key members of their regime's network. That being said, we found some interesting trends in the last year before the regime's fall in 2024. My research partner and I, Karam Shar, we looked at the data, we ran the numbers, and we found some interesting things. Number one, the volume of Captagon was significantly reduced in 2024. There was an upward trend beforehand, but all of a sudden we saw this sudden drop. However, the instances, the different smuggling incidents were increased. So it seemed that these smugglers were reducing the sizes of consignments, trying to shift from maritime to overland routes, and also avoid a lot of Gulf countries as well. We found this, especially in the last year, because this, of course, followed many of the normalization discussions and agreements that were made in the spring of summer of 2023. So we assumed that this was some sort of intentional strategy from the regime to try and restrict the supply of Captagon and create this impression that they were actually cracking down on the trade. It was quite interesting because after the regime fell in December, the new interim government, HTS forces, they pulled back the curtain on many of these laboratories. And you could see that they were still producing Captagon in industrial amounts, so much to the fact where you saw pills of Captagon all along the floor. You saw piles of Captagon in many parts of these different warehouses. And it really showed that many of these regime-aligned producers were trying to create this effect, what I call the step on the hose effect, where you restrict the shipment of Captagon and you create increased demand for the drug. You also use that for negotiation. You put pressure on your counterparts for normalization. But you keep that supply, you keep producing in an effort to then one day try and release that supply of Captagon back out into the illicit market. Now the problem that the interim government faces, they've now pulled back the curtain, they've exposed these laboratories. They think that they've been able to crack down on production of Captagon, but there are still individuals that have worked at these labs, individuals that were not, related directly to the regime, that have knowledge of how to produce Captagon. They've either left Syria into transit countries like Iraq, like Turkey, like Lebanon, or they've been able to produce Captagon in very small amounts. And that's why, despite popular belief that this trade was going to just dissipate into thin air after the regime fell, we still continue to see these large consignments of Captagon flow out from Syria. So that's why I think that this is going to represent a challenge, because a lot of these smugglers, especially along the border region in Dara and Suwaida, or along the border with Iraq, they have political credibility in these local communities. They are, providing a degree of political protection. They're able to generate alternative revenue streams. A lot of these families have been smuggling, whether it be cigarettes, tobacco, arms, Captagon. They've been able to smuggle these different illicit products for generations. And these are actors that the regime is going to have to contend with. These are actors that have degrees of political credibility and influence that the regime is going to have to engage with and try and ensure that they're not going to become rival forces inside of Syria. That's why I was very concerned when we saw these border clashes along the Syrian-Lebanese border. It's also possible that we could see continued clashes along the Syrian-Jordanian border as well, especially as these smugglers try and exert control over these key trafficking routes. So that's what we're seeing right now. We could also potentially see the overspill of Captagon into other countries. And something that I'm very concerned about is that if there is a deficit, if there's a shortage of Captagon supply, we could see crystal methamphetamine take its place in the Middle East. And there's already evidence of crystal methamphetamine demand on the rise. So that could be a very scary picture for public health, security, and governance in the region.
Oh, joy. I'm reminded of Benedict Anderson's famous quote that successful revolutionaries always inherit the wiring of the old state. And I've been wondering, you know, whether they would be able to turn some of those corners, or the infecting things of the old state then infected the new state. And I guess it remains to be seen. Fadi, 3 things for you, and hopefully pretty quick replies. Number 1, pick the number 1 thing off your list of things you didn't say that nobody else said that you want to throw into the conversation. Number 2, there's some real concerns now about and Ambassador Ford alluded to this, of Shara just not relinquishing power. This 5-year plan, why 5 years? You know, other sort of autocratic possibilities in the works, things that could be alarming, that would work against the anchoring that we're hoping for, that he was referring to. So if you could just talk about the fears of just bureaucratized autocracy, you know, being the result of all this, in addition to the security context that it happens within. And then third, if you just had any questions for Ambassador Ford or anyone else to close out with, I know you've been listening to everyone else, so you might have a question for Ambassador Ford since he's been having these other conversations we heard about.
So yeah, thank you, Bill. So let me start with your question about Shara and like the idea of like the 5-year transitional period. So from one aspect, like I see the 5-year transitional period as like 5 years is quite legitimate as far as the need actually to reconstruct the country. In more than one occasion, of course, the government said that, and that is true, that they inherited a destroyed state. The infrastructure is like mostly destroyed in you know, around Damascus, in many other cities as well. Electricity, there is no electricity, like even in, you know, the most time you can think about is like 4 continuous hours of electricity a day, which is of course very like kind of dramatic in many cases. You can think also about like the fact which I mentioned, like when I referred to the security challenge, the fact that you need to build like a police force to impose, of course, you know, security. Many people have been concerned about like the security, about like people, you know, with guns, with arms, which are not controlled by the state. So that is a huge concern. So to rebuild the infrastructure, to rebuild the country, before you go to build like the system, the democracy, where people can, of course, go and vote, you need at least 5 years, especially that with the fact that, you know, speaking about Syrian in diaspora, for example, many Syrians have had kids born in like in different countries, which are still not Syrian nationals. Because of the, you know, no Syrian embassies there, or because the Syrian embassies under, you know, the old regime did not want to collaborate with people who have been seen as, you know, opposing the government, so on and so forth. So there is a lot of work which has to be done before you go and you have like people, you know, voting for the president or the prime minister or whatever. So the 5-year to start with is legitimate for a transitional period. Now, what about like Shara holding, you know, grabbing power and consolidating power? The first thing which I would like to mention here, and that is my personal opinion, of course. Number 1, I know very well that at least Shara and, you know, his inner circle are not going to use the word democracy. So they are going to speak about openness. They are going to speak about, a system, institutions, but they are not going to use the word democracy. Shibani has been cited by some people I know that he would like to refer democracy to democracy without naming it democracy, actually, because they think this word has kind of controversy, especially, among some of the Islamic fighters, which could, not echo well if that word is overused. But from another side, I don't think that Sharia will be able to be an Assad-like figure after 5 years. The collapse of the regime, yes, it happened. The Assad regime, it happened through coordinated military, operation, I will say. But the revolution is owned by everybody in Syria, like the people who have been in jail for 14 years, who have died, families who lost their kids. Everybody has a say on what's coming. Now, from a personal opinion, I can tell you that the national dialogue, which was very much rushed into, is something which many people were not satisfied with. The same thing with the constitutional declaration. It was also very quickly cooked, and then, of course, it was declared. There are many details which we can disagree on, but the main important thing is that, the Assad regime collapsed. Everybody now is, quite on board, I will say, with how the system has to be built. In my opinion, the 5 years is legitimate, but even though that, we can agree and disagree on the background of Sharia and, his inner circle, but I don't see the country can head anymore again towards an Assad-like regime. I don't think, I'm not going to say it's going to be a democracy, a European-like model or a US model after 5 years, but at least we are not going to see a dictatorship. We will have a kind of a system in which the president is, grabbing most of the power, and that is again a concern. There was one lady who was asked, who participated in writing the constitutional declaration. She was asked, what is the mechanism, how you're going to hold the president accountable? And she said, there's no mechanism for how we can, of course, hold the president accountable. My understanding, there is much concern about how, the system will look like. But again, the power sharing in Syria, at least in this transition or interim period, if you like, is not going to look at the end like another Assad regime. The lesson has been learned, and people understood that if you leave, if you don't participate politically in a national dialogue, in constitutional declaration, if you don't have your say, and people are saying everything, of course, whether in Cafe, Ambassador Ford actually mentioned something very important about how people are speaking freely actually on social media, in cafes. So the way I think the country is heading in 5 years, I'm optimistic about building the infrastructure, about Syria re-engaging with the international community and also with the United States. I'm optimistic about that. But the shape of the new Syrian regime, if you want, or the new Syrian system after 5 years, that is something unclear. But what is the responsibility of everybody, the Syrian people, especially the Syrian people, because they are the ones who have the agency, and the Syrian diaspora, and also the Arab countries, is to have their share. And when you are speaking about the Syrian people, when they leave, if you want, the stage vacuum empty for the government to do whatever they want, that is when you will have another Assad regime. But as far as they are participating, in as I mentioned, the national dialogue, the turnout in the national dialogue was very huge. And there were some people complaining that we were not invited, actually. Everybody wants to take share in the new government. Everybody wants to take share in the new national dialogue. So I will say, if there is one thing that the Syrian people learned from the 14-year revolution, is that you cannot be absent from political life. And that is what I think is going to form the shape of the new government coming, after 5 years. Again, I'm not saying it's going to be a democracy. It's not going to be a European model, but it's going to be possibly an Arab model, which is not very much an Assad model, but kind of, you know, an Arab country, another Arab country where you have non-democracy, but not a dictatorship at the same time, where you have institutions, so on and so forth. So I hope I answered the question here. The point which I want to make before I close, I refer to the challenges because there are many opportunities as well, which I'm very optimistic about, and I share very much Caroline, her optimism about Syria. But the challenges ahead are important to look at as much as we want to move forward and we want to think about how we want to make the country better. Because obviously there was a honeymoon after the collapse of Assad, but we need to make sure that this honeymoon is well invested in, because very soon it will be over. And of course, we will have the reality to face. Thank you.
Any question for Ambassador Ford for his final comment, Fadi? Fadi, do you have a question for Ambassador Ford? You're
very
Yeah.
quick. So everybody is speaking now about people are when reporting about the visits of congressmen to Syria. People are over optimistic about a quick lifting of sanctions in Syria, especially those who don't understand the system, how the U.S. works and how different institutions work on decision making. If Ambassador Ford, you can just clarify how these visits can help the Trump administration, or may not, possibly, how far effective these visits are in shaping the Trump's administration approach to Syria. Thank you.
Real quick, the net of American sanctions on Syria is extremely thick and includes both laws and executive orders. The Trump presidency, the Oval Office, can cancel sanctions that are executive orders by a new executive order. It's easy. Other sanctions, which are laws, can only be repealed by laws passed by the Congress, both houses, and signed by the president. So different sanctions are either orders, executive orders, or laws. The visits by the Congress people can be very helpful in terms of explaining to the president and the National Security Council the opportunities in Syria that Carolyn has mentioned and you talked about just now, Fadi, and especially Republican congressmen, frankly. But I think we also need to be really clear, and my advice to the Syrians this week has been, it's the president, not the Republican Party, that matters on this. The Republican Party is not in a position to impose policy on the White House about Syria. They have to convince Trump. That might take a little while, might. Frankly, people like Mohammed bin Salman probably have as much influence on Trump regarding Syria, maybe Tayyip Erdogan, maybe, as Republican Congress people. So let's just be honest about that. But it's a helpful step. It could be helpful. I wouldn't overemphasize it. And then the second point I would make is just to get a sense of where we are with Syria today, Washington, not we, I'm out of Washington, thank God. Shaibani did not get an invitation to come down to Washington. Now, maybe it's going to appear at the last minute, but as of today, Thursday, midday, he's not been invited to Washington. And that is a signal. It is very normal for a foreign minister who's visiting the United Nations to get an invitation to come down and talk to at least the State Department, if not the White House. So I'm a little concerned that Syrians could be over-optimistic from the congressional visits when, in fact, the effort to change American policy on Syria is going to take some time. Put it that way. I'll stop there.
Neil, I know you have to go. A quick final thought and book plug.
Thank you. That's really kind of you. Syria Realism in Action. That's my book. It was published on November the 28th when HTS began their move. So the timing, good or bad, I'll leave that up to you. I mean, we're right to think about the challenges. The challenges are absolutely massive, and when you think about them, I mean, you would never sleep. But this is, you know, this is an opportunity. This is a moment. I said that to a Lebanese official yesterday, and they said, "Don't tell me about moments. In Lebanon, we've had so many moments." But I think in Syria, after 54 years of the Assad, you know, family regime, this really is a moment, and I think there are seeds of optimism, but it really needs the international community to come together to support what should be, as I think everyone on the webinar believes, is a Syrian-led, Syrian agency, as Ambassador Ford said, project to get Syria to a place where Syrians can live and just live a very normal life. Thank you very much.
We are 10 minutes over time, so I'd like to thank all of the speakers for a fascinating, engaging, and truly edifying discussion of Syria today. I certainly learned a lot. I welcome all of you to look for the recording of this event on our website and in social media to be posted probably in the next day or two, and share that with your friends, colleagues, and contacts. Also be aware that the Council will be beginning in the coming days, weeks, and months to produce short-form video content, which you can post around and use to further the discussion on Syria. I also recommend that the viewers sign up for our announcements on our website, nakusar.org, and to consider donating to the National Council or supporting it in any way that you can. We welcome your engagement and look forward to continuing to work with you. And again, a big thank you to a fantastic panel on Syria, and I hope to see you all again soon.